Welcome to the second in a series of interviews on Kontext TV. The series will focus on the new book, The End of the Megamachine, A Brief History of a Failing Civilization by Fabian Scheidler. The book looks at the destructive forces that are threatening human survival. Fabian is the founder of Kontext TV, which has covered global justice issues for more than 10 years. And we're joined today by world-renowned political dissident, linguist, and author Noam Chomsky. He's a laureate professor in the Department of Linguistics at the University of Arizona and professor emeritus at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where he taught for more than 50 years. So I'll begin the conversation by asking Fabian about his book. The book is an attempt to overturn widely held assumptions about the political and economic institutions and ideologies that govern our present moment. You do so by situating these paradigms in a historical context, indeed over the course of several millennia. One of the principal foundational structures of the present is, of course, the state. As against the argument that the state was necessary to, so to speak, limit or contain eruptions of violence in a Hobbesian war of all against all, you, in fact, suggest that violence has increased with the emergence of state power. And you speak of what you term the Four Tyrannies. So talk about that.
Yeah, first of all, I'm so grateful to be here with you and with Noam, whose work was so crucial for my own work. So thank you for joining here. And indeed, the book is about demystifying our history. And I think this is crucial to understand the destructive forces that are by now threatening human survival and the survival of the planet, indeed, with the destruction of the natural ecosystems, with climate havoc, and with the threat of nuclear war. The mystification of our history, of course, tries to legitimize the system we are in as the only possible system or the best system we can have without alternatives. And for such mythologies, there need to be some dark ages, of course. So we have the Stone Age, which is the dark age in our past, and supposedly people were running around with clubs and beating each other to death. And so civilization 5,000 years ago came by and brought humanity to a path to decent behavior. And the state played a crucial role in this narrative, of course. And the second one, and we will talk later about it maybe, is the Middle Ages, of course, from which modernity and capitalism saved us. So concerning the creation of the state, and indeed what has been called civilization 5,000 years ago in Mesopotamia, the first city-states were created, and they were heavily militarized, and the invention of slavery as an institution took place in this time also, and the invention of writing, which was a tool of logistics and of organizing slavery as well. And when we look at the standard narrative, for example, by Steven Pinker and others, they were saying, well, human nature is so violent. People are beating each other to death. This is basically the Hobbesian idea of war against all, of all against all. And so we needed a civilization and a state to come by to save us from this. Now, this is plain wrong in historical terms. We know quite little from the Stone Age, and it's a long period. It's 200,000 years of Homo sapiens, in fact. We know something. We know that there was some kind of violence. It was not that widespread. Steven Pinker has exaggerated this extremely and has been refuted by the most eminent scholars. But what we know is that with the emergence of the first city-states and later with the empires until the Roman Empire, violence really surged in an extraordinary manner. And this has to do with the fact that a military was created. That has to do with the fact that inequality surged The land privatization played a crucial role in antiquity, and it concentrated wealth in the hands of an extremely small number of people, and the others were forced to serve either as soldiers, as mercenaries, or as slaves, or as indentured laborers, wage laborers, and so on. So it was an extremely violent system that was created. The first systems of domination were created at that time, and they called these systems the Four Tyrannies. So the first tyranny is physical power, which of course is most obvious in the militarized state, in mafias as well, in warlord systems from which states very often emerge. The second kind of tyranny is what I call structural violence, a term used by Johann Galtung. And structural violence means that you cannot see the physical violence directly. One example are property relations. For example, if you take Berlin, the city where I live, there are corporations which own hundreds of thousands of apartments, and the poorer half of the Germans don't own anything. So you have to get a job to pay your rent, and people tend to think that this is normal. The people who have all the apartments are very clever, and the others haven't made it, and so on. But the fact is that this is a relation of violence, because if you lose your job, you cannot pay your rent, then the landlord will come and say, get out of here. And if you don't, the police will show up and take you out. And of course, in the United States, currently, the evictions of millions of people this is a very serious example of structural violence, which turns into physical violence. But structural violence tends to be seen as normal. It tends to be seen as something that is natural in a way. And this has to do with the third pillar, ideological power. And ideological power in a systematic way also started 5,000 years ago. The invention of writing was very important. And it was not only used for logistics, but also to write down the mythologies and the religion of the upper classes, which legitimized and justified the system of exploitation and rule of that time. So ideological power tries to impose a narrative that says, well, this is given by God, this order is given by God, or it is natural, it cannot be changed, and all of this. But the interesting thing about all these means of ideological power, they can be turned around in the other way. Writing, for example, was used later with the first prophets like Amos and others to criticize power relations, to criticize property relations. And this is, of course, the case also with modern media. Noam has written extensively about this, media as a power system, but they can be used as a counterforce. So the internet is an example. It can be used as a counterforce. So it's a contested terrain, ideological power. It's never complete. It's never certain. And the fourth tyranny, which I talk about in the book, is a little harder to grasp. And I call it the tyranny of linear thinking. It's the idea that man can control other human beings and nature in general in a linear way by a chain of command. I command and another person obeys. I command and nature obeys. This is an idea that can only evolve when there is command and obedience, like in the military, for example. And so rulers thought that way, that they can control in a linear way their subjects. And the idea that God controls creation is a projection of this earthly rule onto heaven. And in modernity, this idea turned into the idea that man, as an engineer, can control nature as in a relation of command and obedience. And we see that today in the idea, for example, that we can geoengineer us out of the climate crisis, that we can control nature. And I think it's quite an erroneous and dangerous idea, because nature, all living things, are based on cycles, causal cycles. Every effect is at the same time a cause for many other things. So it's not linear, it's not deterministic. Living things work in a completely different way. And if we try to control human beings and nature, we will end up destroying it. And this is quite the case today.
Professor Chomsky, your response to what Fabian said, and in particular the whole question of the effects of the foundation of the state.
Well, it is contested, but I think there's reasonably good evidence of the kind that's been accumulated by anthropologists, Brian Ferguson, Douglas Fry, Stephen Corey, others, that the several hundred thousands of years of human existence prior to the agricultural revolution and the formation of the first city-states and later was not a particularly violent period. In fact, we can see this from contemporary evidence about groups that still live under these circumstances. There are conflicts, but not the kind of organized violence, class structure, and so on that took place with the coming of the nation state. Can't run through the long history, but through in the last 1,000 years or so, just take a look at that, our immediate past, the most violent areas of the world were Europe. European states were being formed in that period. Remember that Italy, Germany, these are pretty recent state formations. They were being formed in the 18th, 19th century, as the same with Britain and France were struggling over who dominates what areas. The state system, as it emerged through the last couple of hundred years, was extremely violent. Finally led to horrendous wars. First, Second World War, a large part of them was determining where the state system should exist within Europe. In fact, about the main reason why we haven't seen any wars since, major wars among powerful states, is that they reached the point where the next time they would have a war, they'd all be destroyed. There's no way to have a war among major states any longer, or everything's over. So Europe moved towards the beginning of the erosion of the nation-state system. Centuries and centuries of trying to create it. Since 1945, it's been slowly eroded. It's a difficult process. A lot of fragmentation and reaction. But the European Union, with all of its major flaws, is some kind of a step towards eroding the boundaries of the major states. So the Schengen Agreement, which is one of the positive sides of the European Union, enables you to travel from Spain to, Eastern Europe without crossing any borders. In that sense, it's rather like the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire was horrible in many ways, but it was a loose structure in which local regions could take care of themselves. So if you were in the Greek community in Beirut, you ran your own affairs. You could travel from Cairo to Baghdad to Constantinople, Istanbul, without crossing any borders. The imperial states, mostly Britain and France, moved in and imposed state structures with no concern for the interests of the populations. They have nothing to do with them. Same happened all over Africa. That's why you see straight lanes on in the state borders. The imperial powers imposed state structures in their own interests with no concern for the fluid, overlapping, complex relations within those societies. So, of course, it always leads to violence and brutality. That's almost natural. Now, but in this current day, we have to face the fact that we have to move towards an erosion of this system Also, as Fabian said, an erosion of the structures of authority and domination that exist within it towards a more fluid structure of the international social order, which will break down structures of authority and domination and also erode borders. Every crisis we are facing now, and there are major crises, is international. They don't have borders. The pandemic doesn't stop at a border. Global warming doesn't stop at a border. The nuclear war will destroy all of us. The erosion of democracy over the world is infectious. Happens in one place, it affects others. So yes, we have to, there have been thousands of years in the Western world, a couple of hundred years of establishing state structures, which they've had their benefits, they've had many horrible consequences. I should add that the same is true in the United States. There's a lot of talk in the United States now about endless wars. We have to get out of these endless wars like Afghanistan. The United States has been in an endless war since 1783. It's one of the rare countries in the world that probably hasn't had a year of peace. One of the major reasons for what's called the American Revolution was the royal proclamation of King George III in 1763, which barred the colonists from moving beyond the eastern mountain range, Appalachian Mountains. They were not permitted to move into what was called Indian territory, the territory of the numerous Indian nations. They were barred by the British for their own not pretty reasons, but that's another story. It's a question of who would monopolize trading rights and things like that. But the colonists weren't accepting that. They wanted to carry out an aggressive war against the Indian nations and expand their own territory and control. Now, that was also true of great land speculators like George Washington, who wanted to move to the West for speculation and profit. As soon as the British were gone, the war started against the Indian nations. Ugly, horrifying history of extermination, expulsion, treaty violation, conquest of half of Mexico in a war of aggression, finally reached what's called the National Territory. But that was a century ago. Then come many other wars. So it's kind of not the same as, but somewhat similar to the imposition of the state system in Europe during the same period. These are not ancient constructions. They're being constructed in recent years. The Second World War was to a significant extent about who's going to control Alsace-Lorraine and the Ruhr Valley. Russia, the French and the growing Prussian imperial empire have been fighting about that for years. There's been a 1,000-year war of the northern powers, that includes Russia, against the mostly Muslim South, which has had horrifying effects all over the world, including the imposition of state systems and all of the internal repression, internal structural violence that Fabian was talking about that goes with it. So yes, I think that picture is basically right. It's not ancient history. It's not just the city-states of Mesopotamia. It's going on like in my own lifetime, for example, still going on. So it's right in front of us. We have major problems in trying to overcome all of these structures of violence and exclusion. We're seeing it right now in a very dramatic way with regard to the preparation of vaccines and the distribution of vaccines. It's a major humanitarian crisis right on the agenda right now. Sooner or later, some vaccines will be available. We don't know which. Right now, China seems to be in the lead. Others may be coming along. They should be available to everyone, like the polio vaccine. When Salk finally managed to create the first polio vaccine, it wasn't patented. He said, this is part of the world environment, like the air we breathe. Everyone has access to it freely. That's the way a COVID-19 vaccine should be, but it's not what's happening. The major drug corporations are trying to monopolize it. In the neoliberal framework, they are given basically monopoly pricing rights, radically opposed to free trade in what's called free trade agreements. So if one corporation, Moderna says, manages to get a vaccine, they're supposed to own it and make the profit from it. Huge profits because of the ridiculous patent rights granted, monopoly pricing rights granted in the trade agreements. There is an international organization, COVAX, trying to bring together countries of the world to cooperate in developing a vaccine and to work out the crucial distributional properties to make sure that the vaccine goes to those who need it, like poor people in Africa, not to those who can pay for it, like the rich countries who can monopolize it for themselves. Well, it's a kind of an uneven effort, partially working, partially not. Just got a hammer blow a couple of weeks ago. Trump announced the U.S. is pulling out of it. Okay. Breaking down the small steps towards internationalism which are required to deal with the crisis. Same with pulling out of the Paris negotiations. Same with trying to destroy the World Health Organization. Same with what Secretary of State Pompeo did 2 days ago. The United States wants to ram through. The United States, of course, broke down and destroyed the agreement with Iran in opposition to the whole world, greatly increasing tensions in that region. The United States wants, there have been UN sanctions. The United States wants them to be reinstituted. It did bring it to the Security Council. No support. One country, Colombia, said okay, the rest said no. A couple of days ago, Mike Pompeo got up and said the sanctions are reinstituted because we say so. And if the Security Council's against it, too bad for them. We're the Godfather, we run the world, and we smash anybody in the face who's in our way. That's the extreme opposite, ludicrous extreme opposite of the internationalism that's necessary. It's imposing state violence to an extent that no country in history has ever attempted it. The Nazis wanted to control Eurasia, not the whole world. Okay, that's the kind of thing we're actually facing, and we've got to deal with it very quickly, or we're all going to be finished.
Well, Professor Chomsky, I'd just like to ask you, you've said, and Fabian's book, of course, does the same, which is to make the argument that the nation-state system has perpetrated violence on a virtually unprecedented scale. You mentioned the European Union as a means of, at least in some sense, transcending the limits imposed by nation-states. Now, is it your sense that that model itself is, rather than being even somewhat universalized, is itself crumbling within the EU with Brexit, but not only with Brexit? I mean, do you see the nation state in any sense, quite apart from the US, where there's no evidence at all that this might happen, but elsewhere that the state could become less powerful?
Well, I should say that the United States is facing a possible situation of breakdown that goes beyond the European Union. The United States is facing possible civil war. It's not a fringe idea. Just a couple of days ago, two highly regarded senior military commanders, General John Nagel, Lieutenant Colonel, another Lieutenant Colonel, wrote a remarkable open letter to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the top military officer in the United States, General Milley. These are incidentally not fringe characters. They are right at the center of the top military establishment, highly regarded. They reviewed for him his constitutional duties in case President Trump refuses to leave office if he loses the election, surrounds himself by paramilitary forces. Somebody else wants to get into the act. Surrounds himself by paramilitary forces of the kind that he sent to terrorize Portland recently. Notice he didn't send the military, which probably wouldn't have followed his orders. He sent paramilitaries, like the border tactical units of the border guards, who terrorized people in the desert right south of where I live in Tucson. Suppose he surrounds himself with them, armed militias. This letter from Nagel said, "It is your duty, General Milley, to send in military forces, maybe the 82nd Airborne Division, to force them out of office." It's never happened in the history of parliamentary democracy. And they are not alone. There's a transition integrity project, a very high level, leading figures in both Republican and Democratic parties, other respected analysts and so on, all right from the mainstream. They've been actually running war games to see what might happen after the election. And they just released their findings. They said in any scenario other than a Trump victory, the scenarios lead to civil war because we have a megalomaniac sociopath sitting in the White House. It's not like, say, Richard Nixon, not the most lovely person in presidential history, but a human being. In 1960, he probably won the election. The election went to Kennedy through machinations by the Democratic Party operatives in Chicago and elsewhere. Nixon didn't challenge it. He placed the welfare of the country above his personal ambitions. So he let it go by, though he probably won. Same thing happened 20 years later with Al Gore, when the election was pretty obviously stolen for Bush. He said, well, not going to destroy the country. Today it's different. We don't have a human being in power, some resemblance to a human being, but quite different. And the country's different. So what's happening in Europe, where there is fragmentation, I'll come back to that in a moment, is happening in even worse ways here. And it's very imminent. Okay? Let's go back to Europe. Yes, the European Union is fraying, and there are reasons for it. We should look into the reasons. Basically two. One is, there are several. One is that the way the European Union was designed, largely under German influence, German banks and so on, the economic system is dissociated from the political structure. The economic system is basically run by an unelected troika in bureaucrats in Brussels. European Council, unelected. European Commission, unelected, IMF, of course, unelected. The European Central Bank, unelected. They make the basic decisions. The decisions are not in the hands of the people of the countries. Well, that's a recipe for disaster. And it was made worse by something that is, by the plague that has hit much of the world in the past 40 years, the neoliberal plague. Its major principle is that government decisions have to be taken out of the hands of government. Government has a flaw. It's partially influenced by populations. So therefore, decisions have to move to totally unaccountable institutions, private power, completely unaccountable to the public, and the principle that it follows is pure self-enrichment. It's a major principle. It was announced to the world by the leading economic guru of neoliberalism, Milton Friedman, at the same time that Reagan said government is the problem, Thatcher said there's no society. So we have to transfer decisions into the hands of unaccountable private power, which is directed in principle solely to self-enrichment. It doesn't take a genius to figure out what's going to come from that. And it's happened. The result all over the world is anger, resentment, bitterness, all justified, fertile territory for demagogues to come along. Trump, Bolsonaro, Orban, others like them say, I'm your savior. With one hand, I stab you in the back. With the other hand, I say, I'm going to save you from what's happening. So yes, that's a very dangerous situation. I think these are the main reasons that what lies behind Brexit? The deindustrialization of England by both political parties. And Labour gave up on the working class just the way the Democrats did here. Anger, bitterness. Let's find some way out of this. The way they are finding out of it happens to be suicidal. They'll turn themselves into even more of a vassal of the United States than they already are. But you can understand the decision. Somebody's responsible for this. I'm not responsible. So let's get out of it and start over. You're seeing similar things in Europe, understandable. And we have to recognize the plagues. One of it is the neoliberal plague. The other in Europe is the specific structure of the European Union, which is deeply anti-democratic and has left people victims to the austerity policies, others which haven't had the same harsh effect in continental Europe that they've had in the United States, because there's more of a social democratic structure remaining, which somewhat protects people, but it has eroded. Now, there are responses to this. Just last weekend, there was a major response. The first meeting, the opening meeting of the Progressive International in Iceland. International effort based on the Sanders movement in the United States, progressive mass movement in the United States, and its European counterpart, the M25, Yanis Varoufakis' initiative, which is transnational European movement, seeking to preserve what makes sense in the European Union and to dismantle and overcome its very serious flaws. Lots of voices from the global south, first conference, international, the possible way to save us from these disasters. So it's not that there's a real kind of international class war going on, major class war. There's an effort to construct a reactionary international based in the White House. That's what the agreements between Israel and the Arab dictatorships are about, forging a component of the reactionary international in the Middle East with the most reactionary states. The Gulf dictatorships, family dictatorships, the Egyptian dictatorship, Israel, which has moved very far to the right, bringing out tacit relations and turning them into formalized ones under the aegis of the United States. The reactionary international will include Modi's India. Modi's destroying secular democracy in India, turning it into a right-wing Hindu nationalist ethnocracy, crushing Kashmir, Orban in Hungary. This is what's happening. Okay, there is a reactionary international run by the White House, where Mike Pompeo can just tell the world, I don't care what you want, we're putting through UN sanctions. You shut up. That's one international. The other is the progressive international. The first is trying to reconstruct the neoliberal system that caused these crises in a harsher and more autocratic form. More surveillance, more control, more centralized power, centralized economic power under the control of the White House. That's one. Progressive international is based on popular forces mobilizing all over the world. And there is a struggle as to what the post-pandemic world will look like. And those are two of the major forces, not the whole world. There's also China and its region and others. But those are two major forces. They all have to do with the kinds of things Fabian was talking about, the nature of the nation state, the violence it brings with it, the chances to overcome it, the internal structural violence having to do with safeguarding the property relations of the very rich and imposing stagnation or decline on others. We should recognize how deeply rooted this is in what had been in the past the most democratic states. Like take the United States. The Constitution of the United States in the 18th century was a fairly progressive document. Not today. I mean, today it's radically regressive, but then it was progressive. But remember what it was founded on. James Madison, the main framer, made it very clear to the Constitutional Convention that a prime responsibility of government, I'm quoting him, is to protect the minority of the opulent against the majority. Protect the property rights of the opulent against the majority. The major scholarly work on the Constitutional Convention, formation of the Constitution, Marshall Clymer, the gold standard in scholarship is called the Framers Coup. The coup that the rich, wealthy, mostly slave-owning framers carried out against the population who wanted more democracy. And the framers wanted less democracy and constructed the Constitution to prevent it, because you have to protect the minority of the opulent against the majority. Now that's the most democratic move of the 18th century. There's been history since, up and back, but we should bear in mind where we're coming from.
Well, Fabian, I mean, earlier you mentioned another theme that recurs through your book, which is that of modernity. And you mentioned that in the context of the formation of the nation state. But in the book, you also question the widely held assumption that modernity brought with it, the advent of modernity brought with it an age of enlightenment, of universal human emancipation. So could you explain what the argument is there, in addition to what you've said about the state and what Professor Chomsky has also just said?
Yes, sure. First of all, I would like to respond also to what Noam Chomsky just said. I think on the side of the progressive internationalism, one thing is very important, and this is the theme of climate refugees. I mean, we will have climate havoc. Maybe we can limit it to a certain extent. Maybe we will limit it to 3 degrees or even 4 degrees, but we can even reach 5 degrees. And so the question is, where will the people in Bangladesh go to when their country is destroyed? I mean, you can only solve this internationally with borders like we have them now with the European Union and the US and so on, shutting borders down. You will have a human catastrophe that is without any parallel in human history. So I think this is a very important part of what Noam just said. And concerning the myth of modernity, if you will, the standard narrative is that we come from the dark Middle Ages and modernity saved us and brought us into an era of light. And this is historically quite wrong, because the main things that are usually attributed to the Middle Ages, the dark Middle Ages, like torture, like the Inquisition, like witch hunts, all of them reached their climaxes in the early modern age, in the 16th, 70s, and partly in the 18th century. And the same is true for slavery, of course, and for all the genocides that we have seen since Columbus. I mean, in the Americas, tens of millions of people have died due to the conquest in South America and North America and in Africa and Asia as well later on. So it's really the essence of what I call the monsters of modernity. And we also have to see the surge of militarization that came in modern times. When William the Conqueror conquered Britain, he had something like 10,000 soldiers. So compared to modern armies, it was tiny. In the early modern age, Wallenstein, the great warlord, in the 30s year war in the 17th century, he had 100,000 soldiers. And later, Louis XIV of France had 400,000 soldiers. And later, there were millions of soldiers in the First and Second World War. And the same is true for arms. There has been an arms race that started in the 100 Years' War between France and England in the 14th and 15th century, with the introduction of firearms. And firearms played a crucial role in the emergence of capitalism, because you need a lot of money to buy firearms. And so states, we were talking about the modern state emerged in a co-evolutionary way with the institutions of capital accumulation in those days. And the reason is that states at that time needed lots of money to buy cannons and to buy mercenaries, and they didn't have the money. So where did they get the money from? They got it from the bankers in Genoa, in Florence, in Venice, and so on. The city-states of northern Italy, in fact, formed quite a similar system to the city-states of Mesopotamia thousands of years earlier. And so the bankers and merchants were lending money to the sovereigns. The sovereigns went to they bought cannons and they bought mercenaries. They went to other countries, looted these countries, and from these looting, they paid, as one would say today, the return on investment to the bankers and merchants. And so it was a business model for them to use the states as a means to produce this return on investment. And the states, which is interesting, in the system were indebted from the outset. The modern state was dependent on capital. And what is interesting about what Immanuel Wallerstein has termed the modern world system, which was created in these days, is that the nation states or the territorial states, they were limited to certain regions, but capital was international from the very beginning. So what we see in neoliberalism in a very strong way today has been there for the last 500 years in a way. So the system that was created out of war, out of this machinery of capital accumulation and war at that time, was something radically new in the history of the world. And it is founded on three pillars. The first pillar is the endless accumulation of capital in an endless cycle of profit and reinvestment. There were many societies in which wealth and income was distributed in a very uneven way, like the Roman Empire, Chinese empires, and so on. But this was the first system where you have created a sort of machine that has to go on forever. This started with the merchants in Italy, with the banking houses, then the first corporations in the early 17th century, like the Dutch East India Company, the British East India Company. They had only one goal, these institutions, which is to increase the money invested, the money of the shareholders. And they have no other objectives than turning the natural world into commodities and to grow in an infinite way. And these are the structures that force the system to grow eternally. And the second pillar is the modern state, as we have talked about it earlier, the modern state that is very much tied to these institutions of capital accumulation, the merchants and bankers from the outset. The merchants didn't want only a return on investment for the money that they gave the state to make war. They also wanted another thing, and this was monopolies. It's one of the dirty secrets of capitalism that it had never really much to do with free markets, but it was based on monopolies. Like today, look at Google or Amazon and so on. So the states granted monopolies to the Fuggers and to many other merchants and to the big trading companies, the joint stock companies like the British East India Company and so on. This was not based on free markets. And the system doesn't work with free markets because in order to accumulate capital in such a way in the hands of very few people, you need monopolies. If you have really free markets, what Adam Smith thought about as a free market system, for example, well, the profits will go down because you have real competition at the top. Capitalism is not based on competition at the top. It's based on competition of wage laborers and competition of small business. But at the top, first of all, there are monopolies. And secondly, they are very much tied to the state. Remember the British East India Company, the Dutch East India Company, they were created by states. They were granted monopolies by states. They were saved by states when they had financial problems like corporations today. And today we have a system which has been sometimes termed the corporate nanny state, and Noam talked about it many times, which if you take the 500 biggest corporations today, which run about 40% of the global economy and 2/3 of global trade, most of them could not survive without huge subsidies. Take, for example, the fossil fuel industry, which is responsible for climate change and climate havoc. They're subsidized, according to the International Monetary Fund, by $5 trillion per year. And the same is true for Wall Street, of course. As we all know, all these big banks couldn't survive without being rescued all the time. The same is true with the car industry. Today in Germany, for example, most of the big car manufacturers would have collapsed already in the 2008 crisis. They were saved. The same is true for the aviation industry, which has been saved in the 2008 crisis, which is saved now in the corona crisis again with billions and billions of dollars, even trillions if you take all these subsidies together. So we have to face the fact that the real capitalism that we have, whether it's neoliberal or not neoliberal, is something that is based on the states and the corporations tied together in a very close way. And the thing is that we use all the subsidies to save the dirtiest industries on the planet, which in fact destroy the planet, while we could use this money for an ecological and social transition. And Noam is absolutely right that in a democracy, even if it's by no means perfect, the kind of republic, as Madison called it, that we have, or democracy, but we have the means as a population, even as voters, to change things in a way that governments, that's why we elect parliaments, to use the money in a different way. So the state should be transformed in a way that we don't use the money to save the corporations which destroy the planet, but to put the money into decentralized structures, into institutions, economic institutions which work for the common good. There are such institutions like cooperatives, communal institutions, and so on. Mostly they are small, some are bigger, but you can really build a system on these institutions, a new system, if the public money, taxpayers' money, is put into this kind of transition. And there are some proposals. Yanis Varoufakis with DiEM25 had a sort of Green New Deal proposal. There are some elements of such a transition. Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, of course, have proposed a Green New Deal with some elements of that. I think this can go much further. But I think we have to be clear that the way forward to save humanity and the planet is to separate the state from the corporations. And this is really a big issue because you know that especially in the US, a lot of representatives are in the pockets of the big corporations. So it's a kind of board democracy. And in the European Union, Noam talked about it, we have this kind of problem as well with unelected bodies and the lobbies of big industries running the show. But we can change that, and that's why media like this, like Democracy Now!, where Nermeen, you are working for, is so important to really show the people that the system that we are living in is not a market system. It's based on states tied to corporations.
Professor Chomsky, your thoughts on this? I mean, you've termed the present order a neoliberal plague, and this question of the fallacy of free markets, what Fabian has said about the relationship between states and markets.
The government always, the states structure the market. They structure corporate governance. They structure the nature of the market. Within the system that they structure, there's an element of the free market interchange and operation, but within the framework that governments establish. So, for example, what I mentioned about intellectual property rights is radically opposed to free markets and grants effectively monopoly pricing rights to major corporations. The same is true internal to corporate governance. Remember, corporations are set up by the state. To incorporate is to get a gift from the state. When you incorporate, the state is saying, okay, we grant you protection of limited liability. That goes back to the origin of corporations hundreds of years ago. So you're getting a gift from the state, and in return, the state determines the mode of corporate governance. Well, the neoliberal plague, which was quite different from the period that preceded it, could go into that. One of the changes it instituted was changes in the rules of corporate governance. It allowed CEOs, heads of corporations, to pick the board that sets their remuneration. Okay, the remuneration is partly salary, partly stock options, all sorts of devices. But there's a board of directors that determines it. The new rules of governance allowed the CEO to pick it. What do you think is going to happen from that? See, management remuneration has shot through the sky. One of the main factors in the huge inequality that's developed during the neoliberal period is simply the dragging of remuneration up for a tiny percentage of the population. CEOs, other managers dragged up with them, university presidents, the whole system. It's just to give you a picture of it. In the last 40 years, 0.1% of the population, not 1%, 0.1%, its share of income has doubled from 10% of national wealth to 20% of national wealth. A recent study just came out a couple of weeks ago from the RAND Corporation, very authoritative study, estimated the robbery of how much the working class and middle class have been robbed by the neoliberal principles instituted in around 1980, which modified the rules radically, allowed tax havens, all sorts of things. What's the total cost to the working class and the middle class, what they call the lower 90% of the population? They estimated at $47 trillion. That's $1 trillion a year stolen from the working class and the middle class just by the manipulations that created the neoliberal system. Now, they have sharply reversed things. The period of regimented capitalism, roughly the Second World War up to late 70s, 1980, was the greatest growth period in capitalist history. It's called the golden age of capitalism by economists, and it was egalitarian growth. The lower quintile did actually a little better than the upper quintile. There were no financial crises because the banks and the financial institutions were under control. There were no tax havens. They were illegal. Treasury Department enforced the law. There was no heaven by any means. All of the basic problems of capitalism that Fabian mentioned were there, but they're in a different form, just as they're there in a different form in social democratic Norway and radically neoliberal America. There are different varieties of state capitalism. It's all state capitalism, but many different varieties. And when we're thinking about the immediate problem, the main problem we face, as Fabian pointed out, is the heating of the environment. If we do get to 3 or 4 degrees centigrade, higher than pre-industrial levels, we're probably finished. It's very hard to imagine that any form of organized human life will survive at that level. The main analysts call it cataclysmic. And we are moving there. So we have to do something to change that. But the time scale for modifying that and the time scale for overcoming capitalism are very much out of line. Overcoming capitalism is a long project. A basis has to be established for it in public consciousness, in alternative institutions of the kind that Fabian mentioned, and so on. Dealing with the coming environmental catastrophe is a matter of the next decade or two. It's going to have to be done pretty much within the framework of state capitalist institutions. Fortunately, these can be very much modified, very much. Like the Green New Deal, the version that was presented to Congress is very vague and imprecise, but there are much more specific versions. One of them is worked out in detail by Robert Pollin, economist Robert Pollin, my friend and co-author. Our joint book on this has just come out yesterday, in fact. A very detailed plan to how to move towards meeting the goals of the top goals of the climate analysts, reduction of emissions by about 50% within a decade, complete net zero emissions by 2050. We can meet that with feasible methods, all known to us, with a fraction, literally a fraction of the state expenditures that were used to bail people out after the pandemic, way less than was used during the Second World War. It's all available, all possible, roughly within the framework of the general state capitalist institutions, but they have to be changed. So take, say, the fossil fuel industries. Right now, there is nothing to stop the government from buying them up, handing them over to the workforce, terminating use of fossil fuels, shifting them to sustainable energy. It's not even a lot of money with the low oil prices. That's perfectly feasible. That can be done tomorrow. It maintains state capitalism, but in a sharply different form. And you can say this across the board. The careful Green New Deal proposals go into all of this in detail. Also how to create better jobs, more jobs, including taking care of the people who will lose their jobs under transition to a sustainable economy. A lot of this is worked out in great detail in the major Green New Deal proposals. Robert Pollins is one, Jeffrey Sachs uses somewhat similar models, comes out with similar results. It's all in our hands. The problems, the deep problems of capitalism will remain. They have to be overcome, but in a longer time range and by other methods, like the ones that Fabian mentioned. Self-managed industries, for example, which are proliferating, cooperatives, localism in food production. Many means can be pursued to try to erode, undermine, destroy the long-standing system. But we have immediate problems to face. Those refugees fleeing from Bangladesh are not in the far future. Just a couple of months ago, there was a cyclone of unprecedented proportions, one of the predicted effects of global warming in East Bengal, West Bengal and Bangladesh. A large part of Bangladesh was underwater. Okay, there was one cyclone. It's going to keep coming. Sea levels rising. These are what's called the refugee problem today, which is in fact, as Pope Francis put it, a moral crisis of the West, not a refugee crisis. That's going to expand enormously very soon. We have to deal with that within pretty much existing institutions. Timescales allow us nothing else. So we have to bear that in mind. A lot of things to say about the Enlightenment and modern history, but there's not the time to go into.
So, Professor Chomsky, I mean, could you elaborate a little bit, because, as we wrap up, what you think, you've said a little bit on the climate crisis that's not only imminent, but in fact present and only likely to accelerate. Whether you see any kind of political will, and if so, where, to institute the kinds of changes that you're talking about and the figures you mentioned have been talking about, and what role you think the kind of more or less global climate activism led by young people, what role and what significance and influence that might have?
It's very significant. I mean, if you look at this international class conflict that's taking place, sort of symbolized by the reactionary international in the White House and the progressive international that just met last weekend. It's based on large popular movements and popular forces. So let's take the climate activism. As you say, that's been led by basically two groups. One is young people whose spokesperson, in many ways, Greta Thunberg, captured it in one phrase: "You are betraying us." That's right. He's talking to us. You are betraying us. It's being led by young people. There's another group leading it, indigenous people. They've been in the forefront of trying to deal with the climate catastrophe for years. First Nations in the Western Hemisphere, indigenous people in South America, all over the world, and tribal people in India. They've been working hard to try to develop, to construct what they have lived with for tens of thousands of years, a relation with the environment which is sustaining. And they've been bitterly attacked in the Amazon region of Brazil. They're facing literal destruction. But these two groups have been struggling to save us from our follies. And take, say, the Green New Deal, one or another form of it is essential for survival. A couple of years ago in the United States, it was way out at the margins, just ridiculed. Now it is on the legislative agenda. That's the result of work by young people. A lot of activists, small group, the Sunrise Movement, young activists who went to the extent of occupying congressional offices. They got the support of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, one of the young people who came into Congress on the Sanders wave. Ed Markey, senior senator from Massachusetts, been interested in environmental issues for all his life. They managed to put it on the legislative agenda. Now comes a battle. Can you implement it? And that, of course, the Republicans don't even talk about. They want to just destroy it totally. They're wreckers. But within the Democratic Party, there's a conflict developing. It's very interesting to watch it. The activists succeed, and the people from the Sanders campaign did succeed in getting the Biden campaign to put a reasonably decent, not wonderful, but reasonably decent climate proposal in their program. The Democratic National Committee, the Clintonites, the donor-oriented segment that runs the party, killed it. You can see it very dramatically. You go back one month, late August. If you looked on you ran on Google, Democratic Party climate program, you got the mildly progressive Biden program. Click on it now. You get how to donate to the Democratic Party. It's gone. Okay. I'm not part of the inner workings, so I don't know in detail how this was managed, but you can guess. Seems pretty clear that the Clintonite managers killed it. Okay, that's going to be a battle that's going on even if Biden is elected. His program was nowhere near good enough, but the DNC program is do nothing. And there's where the activists have to make their move. They did succeed in pushing something forward, but a lot more has to be done. And it is simply a tragic betrayal to leave this in the hands of young people and indigenous populations. They're not the ones who should be leading it. It's the ones with power, prestige, some degree of stability in their lives and professions. They should be leading it. And that has to be fast. It can't wait 200 years. It's going to have to be in the next couple of decades. The disaster may come in 100 years or 200 years, but the sources of it have to be dealt with now. And in fact, the disaster doesn't come like that. It grows. You see bits and pieces of it every year. I see it out the window where I'm sitting, where I haven't seen a blue sky in Arizona for weeks because of the smoke coming from California, which is on fire. Okay, that's coming now. It's not catastrophe not to see a blue sky, but it's a sign of what's coming in a much harsher way, and it will hit most harshly the people who are not responsible for it. Young people, poor people in Africa, and elsewhere. If you look at CO2 emissions, which are destroying possibility for organized human life on Earth, overwhelmingly they come from the rich countries. And within the rich countries, they come from the rich, not the poor. So this is a class problem on a colossal scale. And we have to recognize that and deal with it rapidly and decisively.
Fabian, the last word to you. How to exit the mega machine, and in particular what Professor Chomsky was talking about, the climate catastrophe, which you also mentioned earlier.
Yes, I completely agree with Noam that we need fast solutions even within the scope of the capitalist system. And we need a progressive Green New Deal with very ambitious numbers and a very fast track. I mean, some climate scientists like Kevin Anderson even say that we need to go down in the industrialized world by 80% of our emissions until 2030. Take the car industry as an example. If you have a very mild Green New Deal, then we will have big Teslas be replacing the combustive engines. And we know that electric cars need a lot of CO2 emissions in their production, for the batteries especially. So if you replace the car system as it is today only by electrical vehicles, you don't really solve the problem. You can save some emissions, but you don't go down by 50 or 80% until 2030. So we need to start also to think in another logic. And in terms of cars and traffic, there are a lot of very well detailed proposals to do that, to have more public transport instead of cars. There are cities in Spain, for example, where cars are banned from the inner cities, and it works very well. In Grenoble in France, something like that is happening as well. So you need a very progressive plan to have a perspective also for the people, a positive perspective. Because, for example, getting out the cars from the cities can improve our living conditions, can improve our health. Children can play in the streets. You need a progressive vision for a better world where you can have the need, transport, for example, satisfied with less production of cars. So I think we need both. We need a technical revolution, replacing fossil energies by renewable energies, and we have to, at the same time, make steps to a logic of better living with less goods. Because at the end of the day, we have a huge overproduction. And it's not only the climate crisis. We have caused the 6 big species extinction in the history of the planet. There were 5 big extinction events, the last one being 65 million years ago when the dinosaurs were almost wiped out. And this species extinction would happen even without climate change. So it's also the whole system of overproduction that has to be changed. And when we do that, and I completely agree with Noam that this is a class question and it's a kind of class struggle here, because the overproducers and the overconsumers are the richest 20% of the planet, and mostly in the industrial worlds. Those people have to go down with their production and consumption. And the poor people cannot consume less. They can consume in a different way, but not less. And so we have to face the fact that climate justice is also about distribution, is about taking away the resources from the rich and distributing it more evenly, so 8 billion people can live in a decent way on this planet without destroying it. And so I think we have also to be clear that the path we are facing will not be a linear, smooth way. And for progressive movements, I think it's very important to get prepared for crises, like the crisis of 2008, like the corona crisis, because in this type of crisis, the elites also have problems. They have to justify huge amounts of money that they put in one direction and not in another direction. And in the Corona crisis, we would have had the possibility, if you will, to put all the money not into Boeing, the aviation industry, the car industry, and Wall Street, which was the bailout plan that was actually imposed. But if we had, the social movements were on a higher level in a way, we could turn the situation in a way that the money is put in a different way. But learning from one crisis means to be prepared for the next crisis, to grow stronger. And I think there are signs that this can happen with the convergence of the Bernie Sanders campaign, with Black Lives Matter, with the climate movement, which has been very strong before the Corona crisis. And I think it will re-emerge. And I think the convergence of these struggles is very important. And to see that the social justice issues and the environmental issues can only go together. We can solve this crisis only with those two things at the same time.
Well, with that, Fabian, thank you so much. Professor Chomsky, thank you so much. That ends the conversation.